Jack Daniels. Our whiskey was still here. If he was, Jack might be able to shed some light on the old whiskey with an E or without an E spelling, but he's not, so I'm going to reduce it down to this. Whiskey with an E comes from the Irish spelling. Whiskey without an E comes from the Scottish spelling. The world of whiskey is a contentious pit of historical rivalry. What is whiskey? Ice or no ice? What accent should you have while ordering it? Is carrying some kind of walking cane mandatory? It's a minefield, a topic I'd be destined to lose regardless, so I would rather avoid such a controversial subject altogether. Slavery, the South, Jack Daniels, an interwoven history that makes the story of a whiskey brand, some of which is spoken of more than others, and an intriguing, albeit objective glance at brand building. The founding of the Jack Daniels tale dates back to the mid-19th century in Tennessee, when the young Jack went to live with a local preacher called Reverend Dan Cole. Some report Jack was just 7 years old, which is about 45 years old in today's age. One issue with this period of time is that dates and records are more like placeholders in time, as records were seemingly lost, the victim of fire, or not recorded at all. So how old Jack Daniel was is likely not exact. The same with the timeline for Jack Daniel's distillery. However, the official story is that Jack goes to live on a farm, much like my childhood pet dog. The farm was owned by Reverend Dan Cole. This was the late 1850s. The farm was located about 5 miles outside of Lynchburg, Tennessee, and Reverend Cole owned a still, which a young Jack, or an old Jack in today's age, showed great interest in. In close proximity to this whole situation was a gentleman called Nearest Green, whom according to Jack Daniels' official statement, was an enslaved man. His real name was Nathan Green. Whether the nickname was proximity based or not, Nearest worked closely with Jack alongside Reverend Cole to teach the youngster how to make whiskey. In the years post-Civil War, Reverend Cole found himself with an ultimatum, brought about by his congregation and his wife. He decided to sell his business to Jack Daniel, and if you believe the timeline, he would have been about 16, reportedly 3 years after his mother tragically died. You heard that correctly. Another, more perhaps likely story is that Jack Daniel's distillery was established later, as it is documented that he registered his business in 1875, and it is also documented that Jasper Newton Daniel, aka Jack Daniel, was born in 1846, but a 29-year-old starting a business is far less dramatic than a 16-year-old whiskey maker, born 3 years after his mother died, that learned how to make whiskey age 7. Storytelling is everything, which brings us back to Nearest. Jack Daniels, the company, states that Jack Daniel himself never owned any slaves, and all were hired men. For some, this will be enough. For others, it won't. What is interesting is how Jack Daniels, the company, was rather quiet on the existence of Nearest Green right up until the social winds changed in recent years. The story of Nearest was being uncovered, being told, not by Jack Daniels, but by others not connected to the company. Public Relations 101 comes into play. Get ahead of the story. Make sure you are the one telling it. This is what Jack Daniels did. While not hidden from the founding story entirely, it is now well and truly embraced, celebrated. The distillery even displays proudly a picture of an African American man that they, quote, have reason to believe is Nearest Green's son, George. Note the words reason to believe. My initial thoughts were a little cynical, but the timing of the story and the old picture of a man who may or may not be someone has me believing Jack Daniels. What I think Jack Daniels has been really good at over the years is the storytelling. Jack Daniel himself seems to be well aware of the power of the story, even if he wasn't sure how old he was. He was very astute in the creation of legend. Who buys a cave? Who buys a cave for $2,148? You could probably buy a country for that then, but like a fictional tale told at bedtime, the cave is no ordinary cave, rather endless, cavernous supply of fresh Tennessee spring water, flowing from miles below the earth's surface, almost biblical in grandeur, drawing 800 gallons of water a minute. If you need a unique selling point, this is it. Now, I'm not a chemist. Alkaline and acidity may as well have been an 80s pop duo for all I know, but whether this has any impact on the distilling process is a separate issue. What this definitely is storytelling gold. There's no way you're not handing over your credit card in the gift shop after peering at spring water pouring from a cave. So what is Tennessee whiskey? Country songs aside, Jack Daniels, according to Jack Daniels, is not a bourbon. This is important, I think, though there are governing bodies that believe Jack Daniels is a bourbon, but but these are likely people that don't own their own cave. While the history of whiskey and whiskey in America is too longer a story to tell here, it essentially comes down to the filtration process. It's probably no surprise that a man clearly sporting his own filtration process would think that this was a good idea. The Lincoln County process, named after Lincoln County, Tennessee, involves filtering the whiskey with maple charcoal before being stored in barrels. This fundamental practice, not unique to Jack Daniels, that gives Tennessee whiskey its name, rather than simply being called a bourbon. Why is this important to Jack Daniels? Well, it sounds good. I'm sure advocates and fans, as well as Jack Daniels itself, will say that it makes the drink better, which may or may not be true, but calling it Tennessee whiskey rather than simply whiskey or bourbon is much more emotive. There's a regional identity that Jack Daniels can lay claim to that is much harder for others. Much like the folklore that comes out of the Prohibition era, a tumultuous period for Jack Daniels in a post-Jack Daniel time. The distillery was passed on by Jack Daniel to his nephew Lem Motlow. Lem and his brother Jess were unable to sell their products. Not a great time to own a whiskey company, but it does add character. A big reason why Jack Daniels can sell so many t-shirts, becoming a pop icon of the 20th century. A bottle of Jack was buried alongside Frank Sinatra. It's a story that keeps being told and retold. Apparently, if you go on the tour at the Jack Daniels distillery, you'll find the safe that Jack Daniels is alleged to have kicked in frustration early one morning, seemingly innocuous. His foot is said to have been infected, an infection so bad that it killed him. But like all things Jack Daniels, there is debate as to the merits of the story. The timeline seems to span years for a start, and the infection that killed him might be unrelated. But one thing that we've learned is don't let numbers and facts get in the way of a good story. It's safe to say Jack wouldn't. All things Jack Daniels. Let me know. Thanks for watching.